Imagine going to the store tomorrow with a little blue book in your purse. And inside that book, a set of stamps. And those stamps, not your money, decide whether you're allowed to buy sugar this week. Not whether you can afford it, whether you're allowed to. You could have every dollar in the world in your pocket, and if you were out of stamps, the sugar simply wasn't yours to buy. That was real life for American households in 1943. Not a hardship overseas, not a story in a newspaper about somewhere else. The kitchen, right here, in this country, was rationed by law. Sugar, butter, meat, coffee, canned goods, all of it controlled, all of it counted, all of it measured out in points and stamps that every housewife had to track alongside her grocery list. And somehow, with all of that standing in her way, she still had to put dinner on the table every single night for a family that was hungry whether there was a war on or not. What I want to do today is take you into that kitchen. Not the history book version, the actual version. The one where a woman is standing at her counter trying to figure out how you make something taste like a cake when you're not allowed to buy the sugar or the butter that a cake actually needs. Because what she came up with is honestly one of the more impressive chapters in American food history, and almost nobody talks about it. Let's start with the system itself, because I don't think most people today fully understand how strange and total this rationing really was. In May of 1942, the United States government rolled out sugar rationing nationwide. By spring of 1943, it had expanded dramatically, covering meat, butter, cheese, canned fish, and a long list of processed foods, all under something called the point rationing system. Every person in a household, including children, received a ration book with a set number of points per month. Buying a pound of butter might cost 16 points. A can of salmon might cost another chunk. Once your points for the month were gone, that was it, no matter how much cash was sitting in your wallet. Here's a number that I think really captures the scale of this. The average American sugar ration dropped to about 8 ounces per person per week. Half a pound. For everything. Baking, coffee, jam, anything sweet a family wanted that week had to come out of that half pound, total. Meat rationing settled around 2.5 pounds per person per week, which sounds almost generous until you remember that included everything. Every cut, every meal, every sandwich. This wasn't optional patriotism. It was federal law, enforced with real penalties, and it touched every single kitchen in the country, rich or poor, city or farm. The government had a slogan for all of this, and you'll hear it again in a minute, because it matters. Food will win the war. And the message behind that slogan was blunt. The kitchen wasn't a side note to the war effort. It was considered part of it. If you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into how everyday Americans actually lived through history, go ahead and hit subscribe to Vintage Table USA right now, because this is exactly the kind of story we dig into every week. So now we get to the part I find genuinely fascinating, which is what women actually did once they hit that wall. Sugar was maybe the hardest restriction to work around because so much of American baking in the early 20th century leaned on it heavily. The answer, for a huge number of households, was corn syrup and honey, used not as flavor additions but as direct substitutes, cup for cup or close to it, in cakes, cookies, and pie fillings. Recipe columns in newspapers and women's magazines throughout 1943 were full of phrases like sugarless and victory attached to almost everything. Victory cake, sugarless cookies, because home cooks needed to know at a glance which recipes wouldn't blow their entire month's ration in one baking session. Butter posed its own problem. And this is where margarine, which had existed in a fairly unpopular form for decades before the war, finally found its moment. Wartime margarine usually came pale white, almost colorless, because dairy lobbying groups had successfully pushed laws preventing margarine manufacturers from dyeing it to look like butter, Out of fear it would hurt butter sales. So margarine in 1943 often shipped with a small packet of yellow dye that the housewife had to knead into the white block herself, by hand, in her own kitchen, just to make it look like what she remembered butter looking like. I think that detail says something quietly remarkable about the period. Even getting something to simply look normal again took extra unpaid labor that nobody outside that kitchen ever saw or thought about. Meat is where things get really inventive, and where I think the women of 1943 deserve a lot more credit than history usually gives them. With meat rationed so tightly, organ meats, which weren't covered by the point system at all, suddenly became dinner table regulars in households that might never have served them before the war. Liver, kidney, heart, tongue, all of it. The government actually ran nutrition campaigns specifically encouraging organ meats, partly because they were genuinely nutrient-dense, and partly, frankly, because rationing simply hadn't gotten around to limiting them yet, which meant they were one of the few proteins not counted against a family's monthly points. Meatless meals became a structured, almost official part of the week. Many households adopted what got called Meatless Tuesdays, building dinner instead around eggs, beans, cheese when the ration allowed it, or hearty vegetable dishes stretched with whatever starch was on hand. Casseroles built around a small amount of meat, mixed with a large amount of pasta, rice, or vegetables, let a single pound of ground beef, carefully managed, stretch across multiple dinners instead of just one. And then there's something called mock chicken legs, which I have to tell you about because the name alone makes it worth mentioning. Home cooks took ground meat scraps, sometimes pork, sometimes a mix of whatever was available, shaped it around a wooden skewer or a small bone to mimic the shape of a drumstick, breaded it, and fried or baked it to look, on the plate, like a piece of chicken nobody could actually afford that week. It was theater as much as it was food. The shape mattered, because the shape told the children at the table that dinner still looked like dinner, even when the ingredients behind it had nothing to do with chicken at all. We're getting into the heart of this story now, and if any of this has surprised you the way it surprised me when I first came across it, a like on this video genuinely helps more people find this kind of history, so I'd really appreciate it if you've got a second. I want to talk about victory gardens for a minute, because rationing alone doesn't explain how families actually got enough food. The garden filled in an enormous amount of the gap, and the scale of it is honestly staggering. By 1943, something close to 20 million victory gardens existed across the United States, in backyards, vacant city lots, even carved into the edges of public parks. Estimates from the period suggest these gardens were producing somewhere around 40% of all the vegetables consumed in the country that year. 40%. Not from farms, from regular families, growing tomatoes and beans and squash in whatever patch of dirt they had access to, specifically because rationing had made store-bought produce both scarcer and more valuable to save for other things. This is where canning comes back into the story too. A garden only solves your problem for the months things are actually growing, so everything that came out of that victory garden in July and August had to be put up in jars to survive through the winter, on top of whatever rationed food the family was already carefully stretching. The labor here was enormous, and almost entirely invisible. Government posters at the time openly called canning a patriotic duty, and they weren't exaggerating the importance of it. A pantry full of home-canned vegetables wasn't just good planning anymore. In 1943, it was treated as something close to a contribution to the war itself. There's one more shortage worth talking about before we step back and look at the bigger picture, and that's coffee. Because the way households handled it tells you a lot about how far this rationing reached into the small, ordinary comforts of daily life. Coffee rationing hit in late 1942, driven largely by wartime shipping shortages rather than domestic production, since almost all of it had to come in by boat from places where those boats were now needed for the war effort instead. Each adult was limited to roughly 1 pound of coffee every 5 weeks, which, for a household used to multiple pots a day, meant the coffee in the percolator had to be stretched the same way everything else was. Many families started cutting their coffee grounds with roasted chicory root, the same trick that had shown up decades earlier during harder economic stretches, or simply reused the same grounds for a second, weaker pot, rather than throwing them out after one use. Cooking fat, in general, followed a similar path to butter, just quieter. Bacon grease, already a kitchen staple before the war for the reasons we've talked about on this channel before, became even more precious once both butter and the fat trimmed from rationed meat were treated as something worth saving rather than discarding. There were actual government collection programs during the war, encouraging households to save used cooking fats and turn them in, because rendered fat was a key ingredient in making glycerin, which the military needed for explosives and medical supplies. A housewife pouring her leftover bacon grease into a tin wasn't just being frugal in 1943. In a very direct, very literal sense, she was contributing to the war effort, one coffee can at a time. I think this is one of the more striking details in this whole story. The line between kitchen habit and wartime contribution had basically disappeared. Nearly everything a woman did at her stove that year carried a small piece of the war effort inside it, whether she thought about it in those terms or not. I want to slow down here, because I think there's something underneath all of this that's easy to miss if we just treat it as a list of clever recipes. Every single substitution we've talked about today, the dyed margarine, the mock chicken legs, the meatless Tuesdays, the garden stretched to its absolute limit, required a level of constant mental math that I don't think we fully appreciate from a distance. A woman running a household in 1943 wasn't just cooking. She was running a small logistics operation every single week, tracking ration points across sugar, meat, butter, and canned goods simultaneously, while also trying to make sure her children didn't feel like they were eating differently from before the war, even though almost everything about how they ate had changed. And she was doing this in a huge number of households, while also working outside the home for the first time, in factories and offices that had opened up because the men who used to hold those jobs were overseas. The image of women stepping into wartime factory work gets a lot of attention, and it should. But the kitchen work happening at the exact same time, the rationing, the substitutions, the gardening, the canning, was its own full-time, unpaid, largely unrecognized job running in parallel. I think that's the part of this story that deserves a lot more credit than it usually gets. Now, I don't want to tell this story as if it was some kind of charming, scrappy adventure, because for the people actually living it, a lot of it was genuinely stressful, exhausting, and at times frightening. And I think it's worth saying that plainly. Families weren't choosing to ration their sugar because it sounded like a fun challenge. They were doing it because the country was at war, because resources were genuinely scarce, and because the alternative, in a lot of households, was simply not having enough. Behind every clever substitute recipe is a woman who would have much preferred to just buy butter, sugar, and a roast for Sunday dinner without thinking twice about it, the way she had before 1942. The ingenuity we're celebrating today came directly out of real constraint, real anxiety about feeding a family, and, in many homes, real worry about a husband or son who wasn't at that dinner table at all because he was somewhere overseas. So when we look back at something like mock chicken legs or sugarless victory cake and find it clever or even a little charming, I think it's worth remembering that the charm was a byproduct, not the goal. The goal was simpler and a lot more serious than that. It was just getting through the week with a family that was still fed, still together, and still hoping the war would end soon. Here's what stays with me most about all of this. Nobody handed these women a manual for how to cook through a war. There was no precedent, no internet full of tips, no guarantee any particular substitute would actually work until someone tried it in her own kitchen first, sometimes wasting precious, rationed ingredients in the process of figuring it out. Every sugarless cake recipe that ended up printed in a magazine started somewhere as an experiment in somebody's actual kitchen. Probably more than one failed attempt before it worked. I think what this period really shows is that resourcefulness isn't a personality trait some people happen to have and others don't. It's mostly just what happens to ordinary people when the usual options disappear and the people they love still need to eat. Nobody in 1943 thought of themselves as inventive or admirable for kneading yellow dye into a stick of margarine. They thought of it as Tuesday. That, to me, is the most impressive part of the whole story. Not that something extraordinary happened, but that something extraordinary became completely ordinary because it had to. If anyone in your family lived through rationing, or if a recipe like the ones we talked about today ever got passed down in your house, even just as a strange old family story about margarine or organ meat, I would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments below. These memories don't usually survive past the people who lived them, and every time someone shares one here, it adds something real to a piece of history that deserves to be remembered properly. If you want more stories like this one, researched carefully and told honestly instead of dressed up for effect, go ahead and subscribe to Vintage Table USA. There's a lot more of this country's kitchen history still waiting to be told. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.